Imagine a world where NASA's Apollo mission never stopped at the moon. What if we had continued to push deeper into the solar system with human exploration? Do you think NASA really could have landed people on Mars with 1970s technology? Well, the top aerospace scientists of the day certainly believed that they could, and they were so confident in that ability that not just one but several plans were drawn up over the years that would serve as a blueprint for human colonization of the planet Mars before the end of the 20th century. So today we are bringing those old visions back to life for a bit of science fiction escapism. This is the retro-futuristic mission to Mars that never was. This is the space race. Let's begin our journey in the 1940s with a vision straight from the mind of Dr. Wernher von Braun, also known as the father of rocket science and the architect behind NASA's Apollo program that landed the first men on the moon. Von Braun got his start in rocket redesigning ballistic missiles for the Nazi army in his home country of Germany. Von Braun invented the V-2 rocket, which was the first ever long-range guided missile. Following the war, Von Braun would be recruited by the United States military and eventually transferred to NASA, where he would serve as the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. The United States hired a lot of Nazis back in the late 40s and early 50s, which is a whole other video. Anyway, in his free time between serving Adolf and Uncle Sam, Wernher von Braun completed a work that would come to be known as Project Mars. This was a 280-page novel that outlined von Braun's plan for a crewed mission to the Red Planet using rocket technology that he was actively developing at the time. Most of the book is just a fictional story about the first crew of people traveling to Mars, kind of like a science fiction novel, except written by an actual genius rocket scientist with a lot of insider knowledge. The story section of the novel is bonkers. It's all about human society in the not-so-distant future that is finally united in the aftermath of a catastrophic Third World War, except world peace is maintained by a giant Death Star-like orbital weapon that instantly obliterates anyone on Earth who steps out of line. I guess you can take the rocket scientist out of the violent fascist regime, but you can't take the violent fascism out of the rocket scientist anyway. Beyond the Nazi and space fan fiction aspect, von Braun filled the later pages of his book with all of the formulas and calculations that would be required to achieve Project Mars. The math was there, written by the same hand that would go on to design the Apollo moon mission, so it feels like a very legitimate blueprint for interplanetary travel. Most importantly, von Braun had all of his ideas illustrated in the most amazing retro-futuristic Technicolor art style that would clearly go on to influence generations of science fiction, from 2001: A Space Odyssey to Star Wars 2. Elon Musk. I mean, look at von Braun's Mars rocket, and then look at the Starship. According to Project Mars, the first stage of the mission is to establish a large-scale human presence in low Earth orbit. That means gigantic ring-shaped stations that rotate slowly to generate artificial gravity, and an orbital construction yard where the Mars fleet would be assembled. One of von Braun's most famous rocket designs was the massive Fairy rocket, a fully reusable space plane and booster system that would make frequent trips from the Earth's surface, carrying up materials for the orbital construction projects from orbit. A massive fleet of transportation ships, cargo haulers and Mars landers would be assembled 1,000 miles above the Earth. According to von Braun's design, the crew would live in these big spherical sections of the ships, and each one would be powered by a cluster of liquid-fueled rocket engines supported by the massive network of fuel tanks that made up the body of the vehicle. At the time, von Braun was a big fan of hypergolic propellants, which are chemicals that will self-combust when combined under pressure. It's a very easy way to start a rocket engine in the vacuum of space, and it's still commonly used to this day. The Draco thrusters on a SpaceX Dragon capsule are very small hypergolic rocket engines. Once ready, the Mars fleet would fire their engines to break free from Earth's gravity and insert themselves into a direct trajectory for Mars, using the home and transfer window to achieve the shortest distance between the two planets. Von Braun imagined that it would be 260 days or 8.5 months between leaving Earth orbit and entering Mars orbit. On approach to Mars, the ships would turn around and fire their engines again to reduce velocity and settle into a low orbit around Mars of 620 miles above the surface. From here, the Mars lander vehicles would separate from their main engines and fuel tanks to prepare for landing. In von Braun's estimation, these vehicles would function as gliders through the Martian atmosphere and allow the crew to make a controlled soft touchdown on the planet's surface. After landing, the main body of the vehicle would be separated from its glass wider wings and brought into a vertical position, and now the crew in their spacesuits would set up their ground station on Mars using supplies that had been brought down in the massive lander vehicle. These first people would explore the planet and begin to establish the first human colony on Mars. With their mission complete, the vertical rockets would blast off from the surface and rejoin the fleet that has been waiting in orbit. With the crew returned to their transport ships, the fleet makes another burn of their rocket engines to set a return trajectory for Earth. Sounds easy enough, right? And in the late 1940s, when this plan was created, everything that we just went over seemed abundantly possible to any well-informed rocket scientist. The biggest problem was that we didn't actually know very much at all about the planet Mars in those days. Even von Braun himself, with all of his genius, was sure that we could find ancient canals of running water lush from vegetation and lakes on Mars, even an advanced species of aliens. And to be fair, von Braun got most of his assumptions right, but made a couple of fatal mistakes. Aside from there being no life on Mars, there's also virtually zero atmosphere, less than 1% the density of Earth's, so a gigantic glider-winged rocket plane like von Braun imagined as his Mars lander would have never worked in practice. Moving on to the later 1950s, the plan for human spaceflight to Mars was becoming a little more refined and some cutting-edge new technologies had entered the game for the United States. This was the dawn of the atomic age. Nuclear energy had finally been harnessed to generate electricity, and people at the time started to believe that nuclear power would become this unlimited energy source that could power America into the space age. Of course, rocket scientists we're already looking at this technology as a way to power spaceships on long-duration flights into deep space, so we're going to bring in some designs by atomic scientist Dr. Ernst Staulinger. He was a close colleague of Wernher von Braun and a fellow Nazi-turned-US government asset. Staulinger had updated von Braun's Project Mars concept for the atomic era. He replaced the hypergolic chemical rocket ships from von Braun's illustrations with his own nuclear electric spacecraft. Staulinger's Mars plan was so highly regarded that it ended up on American TV in 1957. Walt Disney had a weekly television program back in the day called Disneyland, which was an anthology series that covered all kinds of different topics. For one episode, Disney wanted to feature the planets of the solar system in an episode titled Mars and Beyond. They drew up all of these wild animations that imagined what aliens from Mercury, Mars and Venus might look like. It's awesome, super creative, and really shows just how curious people of the time were about the nature of the solar system. Anyway, to add in a more grounded take on interplanetary exploration, Disney featured a segment with von Braun and Staulinger where they showed off models and illustrations of Staulinger's atomic electric Mars transport, explaining how the human journey to Mars would play out. Much like in Project Mars, the components and materials of the giant nuclear ship would be transported into space by the chemical-fueled ferry rocket, where they would be assembled at an orbital construction yard. Foreign at its widest point, the nuclear electric ship would be 500 feet across, and it would carry a separate Mars landing vehicle along with it. At the bottom of the ship's long central pillar is the nuclear reactor. By the process of nuclear fission, or splitting the atom, the reactor will generate a constant supply of thermal energy. That heat will boil a reservoir of silicon oil into steam that will travel up the central pipe and drive a turbine generator, which will convert the rotational energy into electricity that will power the entire ship. The giant circular panel at the top of the craft will function as a condenser that traps the steam and cools it back to a liquid state so that it can be reused in the atomic generator over and over again. The ship's main engine is located halfway down the main pillar. It would have a platinum metal grid that would be electrically charged with energy from the steam turbine. Then vaporized particles of the metallic element cesium would be blown into the ultra-hot grid, which would ionize the cesium atoms and create an electrical field that blasted the atoms out into space at high velocity. This will create thrust to move the spaceship in the opposite direction of the particle flow. It would be a relatively low amount of thrust, but the efficiency of the electrical engine would allow it to continuously operate for the entire duration of the flight. This is pretty much the same way that modern ion thrusters operate on our existing space probes and satellites. So credit to Staulinger for nailing the technology 70 years ago. At the top of the ship in the center of the condenser circle is the cargo space and crew quarters for up to 20 passengers. Mounted on the front side of the ion engine is the Mars landing craft. Once the main ship settles into Mars orbit, the lander will release and fire its engine for a descent into the Mars atmosphere. Here's another area where Staulinger improved on von Braun's design. Instead of a glider, the Mars lander will deploy a giant parachute. This is a much more effective air brake, but still not enough to land softly in the Martian atmosphere. So before touchdown, the main rocket motors will fire a landing burn just like a SpaceX Falcon 9 and slow the craft for a safe landing. This combination of parachute and propulsive touchdown is the same method that NASA used with their most recent Mars lander. Once the landing party has completed their surface exploration, they return to the lander and blast off in an ascent module that is built into the top of the vehicle. This is essentially the same method used by Apollo astronauts to lift off from the surface of the moon using the nuclear electric thruster. The journey to Mars would be much longer than with a high-thrust chemical burn. We're looking at 13 months in transit. It's going to take 4 months just to build up enough velocity to escape Earth's gravity, then 7 more months to reach Mars, and then 2 months to slow down and settle into Mars orbit. Staulinger imagined that a fleet of 6 nuclear ships would embark on this odyssey into deep space, and again at this time no one was really sure what we might find on the surface of Mars. There could be anything from low-level vegetation to lizards and insects to the ruins of a long-dead civilization. They had no way to know for sure, but they were determined to find out by sending people to the Red Planet. Now Staulinger's technology was pretty sound, and most of his plans still hold up in the modern day, the biggest flaw being the extremely slow transit time of over 1 year just to arrive at Mars. We know now that this is far too long to expose people to the microgravity environment and cosmic radiation of outer space, so that was a problem. But the ideas presented in Mars and Beyond were moving in the right direction. Moving on to the 1960s, and things are going spectacularly well at NASA's human space flight program. Mercury and Gemini were successful at getting the first American into space, reaching orbital velocity and conducting extra vehicular spacewalks. The Apollo program is moving ahead at full steam, and our old pal Wernher von Braun is putting the finishing touches on his Saturn V rocket that will power the first men to the moon and bring them home again. This is the high watermark for human spaceflight, and NASA is already turning their attention to the next step beyond Apollo. They want to send people to the planet Mars, and they want to do it sometime in the early 1980s. This led to a new wave of Mars mission proposals. Everyone wanted in on the action, even the Ford Motor Company submitted their own proposal for a Mars transportation system. We're going to focus specifically right now on a white paper from the Boeing Aerospace Division in 1968. This is probably the most legitimate mission design coming from a company that was already heavily involved in the spaceflight program and would continue to be for decades to follow. What Boeing brought to the party was a design for a nuclear thermal rocket propulsion stage. This is a much different beast to the nuclear electric ion thruster that we talked about earlier, so we have the same idea with a nuclear fission reactor, but instead of using the heat to make steam and then using the steam to make electricity and all that, we just take the red-hot nuclear reactor core and pump liquid hydrogen fuel right into it, add ultra-cold cryogenic temperatures. Hydrogen is converted into a liquid state. This densifies the atoms and creates a highly energetic propellant. Von Braun had just figured out how to cryogenically liquefy both hydrogen and oxygen for the propulsion system of his Saturn V. This unlocked significantly more power than his previous hypergolic fuel sources. Anyway, once this densified liquid hydrogen hits the super-hot nuclear reactor, it's going to rapidly expand back into a low-density gas, which is then channeled out through the engine nozzle as exhaust and creates thrust. So this is like halfway in between a conventional rocket engine and an electric ion thruster, providing an ideal combination of both thrust and efficiency. And this nuclear rocket technology is something that NASA was already developing under Project Nerva, Boeing's interplanetary spacecraft concept. Fixed the last major problem with sending a crew to Mars. According to their calculation at the time, it would take less than 200 days to reach orbit around Mars. Getting back again would be a much slower process due to the majority of propellant stages being used up on the outbound trip. We're still looking at around 600 days of total travel time, give or take a few weeks depending on the year of the launch, but overall that's pretty good. Much like the previous Mars ships we looked at, the Boeing interplanetary spacecraft would need to be assembled in orbit, with the 5 nuclear propulsion modules being so gigantic that each one would require a Saturn V rocket equipped with 4 additional side boosters just to reach orbit. Like most rockets, the majority of this structure is being taken up by engines and fuel tanks, so it's just the very top section that contains the 3 crew modules. In the middle is the mission module. This is the primary crew quarters for the journey to Mars and back. It's a cylindrical pressure vessel that is divided into 4 decks and can support a crew of 6 people. At the top of the stack is the Mars Excursion Module. This vehicle has a descent stage for landing on Mars and ascent stage for returning to the main ship. The Mars Excursion Module would support a crew of 3 people for a 30-day exploration of the Martian surface. At the bottom of the stack is the Earth Entry Module. This one is only used to get the full crew of 6 people back down to Earth on the very last day of the mission. It works just like every other Earth reentry capsule with a heat shield and a parachute system. So here's the mission profile. Once the full vehicle is assembled and ready to go in Earth orbit, it's going to fire up one massive departure burn from the first stage engines. This consists of 3 nuclear propulsion modules burning in unison that's going to provide all of the thrust required to reach Mars very quickly. Then on approach to Mars, the rocket is going to flip around and fire up the second stage, which is just a single nuclear propulsion module, and that is going to provide the velocity change needed for an orbital insertion. From here, the 3-person landing party transfers into the Mars Excursion Module and separates from the main vehicle. The Excursion Module has a main engine that will perform the deorbit burn to bring it down through the Mars atmosphere, and at that point it's going to deploy a main parachute that slows down as much as possible before the descent stage engines fire up for the landing burn and soft touchdown. After spending 30 days on Mars, the crew will leave the descent stage behind and return in the ascent stage of the module. This uses 4 side boosters to get off the ground, which are then separated, and the stage 2 ascent engine takes the module into orbit to meet back up with the main ship. Now all that's left is to fire up the final nuclear engine and perform a departure burn to return to Earth. On arrival, the Earth Entry Module will separate and come back down for a splashdown landing in the ocean. So that all sounds like a pretty solid plan. It would be a massive undertaking and would be incredibly difficult to pull off. 5 launches of the gigantic and fully expendable Saturn V just to make one also fully expendable interplanetary spacecraft. That's just a lot of resources to spend on one vehicle that may or may not have succeeded, but everything we just went through should have at least been possible, even with 1970s technology. So why did NASA never send people to Mars? Well, it's complicated. There's no one answer. By the early 70s, John F. Kennedy and his ambitious dreams for the future were long dead. They even shot the guy's little brother. It was terrible. The Democratic Party had been voted out and replaced with a Republican government. The war in Vietnam was getting worse and worse with no sign of an end. The public had already lost much of their interest in space exploration, and NASA was receiving a much smaller percentage of the federal budget to work with. So it came down to President Richard Nixon. He had 2 proposals sitting on his desk, one to expand the Apollo program to explore Mars and the other to develop the space shuttle program. There was not enough money to do both. Meet us back here every week for more updates on everything aerospace industry and interstellar exploration related. Make sure to give the video a thumbs up today if you liked it. That really helps us out for real. And subscribe to the Space Race for more videos just like this. We do 1 long form essay and 1 news update every week, and if you'd like more, we've got 2 more on the screen for you right now.